All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome y'all back to the series closeout of Purpose Driven Pivot. I am extremely excited to wrap up this particular series. And first, let me say thank you so much to so many folks that have tuned in to a lot of the content that we've been producing over the last year. As I mentioned during this interview series, that we were going to run this for a year, and we started back in June of 2022 during the really the height of the pandemic and the conversations that we were having back in that time period. On Juneteenth was our kickoff event. We said, man, we got to keep the conversations going and rolling. Just a little bit about that event, as I mentioned it sometime before, the event that we did back in 2020 was called Power in Our Purpose, where I was able to bring together a lot of leaders across the city of Atlanta, folks that I consider friends, folks that I've had really amazing relationships with over the time. And I attended a protest during that season. I remember having candid conversations with my wife about how I was feeling in that season, and not just related to some of the social justice conversations that we were having because they were just so thick, but the conversations that we were having related to just how a lot of things were changing due to COVID-19, how you weren't able to see family, how you weren't able to really, as it related to our work and our lifestyles, like things were just completely different. And they evolved so much over time, from February 2020 to going forward through the summertime and into the fall. And, as we fast forward to now, I just think about, through the grace of God, the opportunity we've had to have that strong day that featured so many awesome speakers. We had about 150 people that were present at that event. And we said, we just got to keep it going. When things kind of took another turn for COVID, we said, we can't necessarily have an in-person event. And I had conversations with folks that have talked and even attended the session that we had. And I said, we've just got to go virtual. And out of that, I prayed over it. Part of the essence of even that event that we did last year in 2020 was obeying, really a message that, I received from God about just doing something. And we did it within 48 hours, got it vertical and executed it. But just in the conversations that I had, y'all, the ability for us to come back and say, we're going to, keep this conversation going through purpose-driven pivot, having candid conversations with people about not just how they're feeling, but how they pivoted along their journey. And it has been such a remarkable experience that, we've had speakers that have come from a lot of different industries that have had stories related to trauma, had stories related to how they pivoted professionally and everything in between. Those videos and those conversations can be found at my website, gregclay.com. And even if you're watching this closeout session for the first time, or you've seen a few interviews or you've seen all the interviews, one of the consistent themes that have been kind of a challenge around what it is that we've been talking through has been how we've been dealing with these pivots. And while pivot, the word pivot itself had become really in this season a very popular word, the conversations that we were having with people about their individual walks and their individual journeys, y'all, they've just been really phenomenal. And so I've been honored to, in obeying the message from my God, to have the opportunity to not just have that kickoff event that we hosted, but to also have the interviews that we've had over a year's period of time. And I'm so grateful for the folks that have allowed us to not just logistically pull things off, in addition to the folks from a content standpoint, to yield their voice, yield their time, yield their talent and their treasure to moments like these so that we can grow from them. And so I've had a lot of conversations about how best to close this out. I thought about, doing some interviews. I thought about bringing some people back and having kind of this round robin. But, while that might be an opportunity in the future, I said, this can be a moment to where I not only thank the people that have participated, but also thank the viewers, because we impacted thousands of people through this particular platform. I've received from text messages to DMs to calls, direct calls and emails about how certain conversations, how certain narratives have allowed people to really, really make it through. Some conversations, some moments, some milestones in others' lives that have given others the confidence to push forward. And so I want to shout out a good friend, McKinley Milton. McKinley is an academic scholar and friend. I was having a conversation with him and my wife, and thank you, Shani, for your continued support, especially through this platform, about some of the best ways to close things out. And I said, well, as we were conversing, he said, man, it'd be awesome if you talked about kind of the top 5 things that were lessons learned, really top 5 lessons learned. And so I wanted to make sure I shouted out McKinley because, while he wasn't someone that we interviewed, I really, really think he's one of the sharpest minds of our generation. So be sure to check him out. But let's get into this. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about top 5 lessons learned again from the Purpose Driven Pivot series. Then I'm going to move into some of the first steps to make plans after you decide to make that pivot. Because a lot of the conversations that we had, for folks, again, that may be familiar with this interview series, a lot of the guest speakers, a lot of the guest conversations that we had was about some of those practical connections and those practical lines associated with first and second and third steps. So I thought that was a very, very important thing to bring back to the table. And last but certainly not least, I had a concluding kind of call to action related to the things that we can have a conversation about today. And so let's get into it. Let's get into it. So top 5 lessons learned from the Purpose Driven Pivot interview series that I was able to host with so many phenomenal folks. This isn't in any particular order, and so it's not necessarily ranking them. I just wanted to make sure that we chronicle these because I think they add value, and I think they will add additional context as we think through other interviews that you may not have seen for interviews, some of your favorite interviews that you've seen, some of the reminders that we can kind of go back to. And again, you can find all of that content at gregclay.com. But let's get into these 5 lessons learned from the series. The first one I wanted to kind of talk through was, you starting with your guiding compass. For some people, it's their faith. For some people, it might be this narrative, the spiritual narrative. But from the conversations that we had, I really, really believe in, when we're starting to think about things differently, no matter where you may be on your journey, the need and the necessity around this guiding compass that will anchor you in your values. This guiding compass, whether it be scriptures that you read every day, whether it be your own personal testimony associated with your journey in itself. But I really, really believe that, as a part of this conversation, when we talk about pivoting, having that guiding compass is so, so very important. It was a very reoccurring theme around what kept some of the guests on this particular interview series motivated in some of their times of need. It became this consistent theme around how folks made it through some of their most challenging days as well. Because we all know that some of our best days when we're out going and living in our purpose, they might not be as challenging as some of those days that, you say, man, do I really, really want to get out of bed because I either mentally or physically don't feel connected to whether it be the moment that you're in or the work that you're doing. But this compass, having this compass, whether it be spiritual, whether it be value driven, is something that I really, really learned from the conversations that we had. And so I continue to love to hear your thoughts as folks kind of tune in. What's up? I see folks kind of logging in as well and sending a lot of good vibes. The second thing is you must have a support system. And again, y'all, this isn't in chronological order. This is just came from, my wrap up around feedback that I've received and also being a student of the conversations that we've had during this interview series. Having that support system, whether it be 2 people or 10 people, I've been very, very fortunate to have from a context of friendships, from a context of people that care about me, this realm of accountability, but also this very, very creative realm of people that I can talk to about new and fresh ideas, people that have known my journey and have seen my growth, and even some of those newer folks that might not be as familiar with my story or my journey. Being able to have them as a part of my support system, whether it be through friends or associates or colleagues, having that support system really, really creates this environment around you that enables you to do so much more. While, and I hear this term often, a lot of us say, well, I did it by myself, or I'm self-made in that regard. Yeah, well, you certainly from being motivated and driving, your ambition, people have entrepreneurial spirit, get a go type attitude, this attitude that says, hey, I'm going to attack my day and seize my day in a real carpe diem type format. But there's also these conversations that we have to have about our support systems, and our support systems are extremely important in regards to who you're talking to on a regular basis. On a weekly basis, are you downloading with folks? On a monthly or quarterly basis, who are you talking to? I know that even in my community, when we talk about counseling and seeing professionals, that has become a part of folks' support systems. And that was even conversed about during this interview series as well. And so that's the other thing that I want to make sure that we brought back as something that, I personally learned from this conversation is that, your support system and the people around you, when you're thinking about how best to pivot, how best to push forward, these folks that you have, that are around you, the content, the ability for them to be able to be this driving force when you're on your best, and when you're at your worst, and even in the middle, your support system is one that you really have to tune in and tap into. And if you don't have that today, there's no better time to start. There's no better time to begin to have those conversations with folks and to build those relationships, similar to how bricks stack on top of bricks to build a house. It's never too late to start to build those very connecting relationships that enable you forward on your journey and your purpose. The other thing that I wanted to make sure I mentioned was, keeping score. We've got to make sure that on our path, that we keep score to those things, not just to ourselves, but even for those quantitative and qualitative metrics out there in the world, whether it be every month or every quarter or every fiscal year or whatever it might be, especially related to your passion, how and your purpose. How are you keeping score and keeping yourself not just accountable, but measuring your success going forward? Right. And so when I say keeping score, it really is this very practical way in which you say, okay, I've got this goal. If I'm an author or would be author, I've got this goal to write this book, and I want this book to be 250 to 300 pages. If you haven't written the first 10, you're not on the way to writing that book. If you say, hey, I've really got this goal from a weight loss standpoint, I've been looking at what's been going on. I really want to get healthier. The health has been a part of my transparent journey. And I said, there are a couple of things. I wanted to get my blood pressure, by the grace of God, which is, normal. And I've been open and transparent about that. And I wanted to get my weight down. I lost a significant amount of weight. But that started with me saying, okay, I weigh this much, and I need to get it down to, and I need to be running. I need to have, activities. I got a trainer. Shout out to Ramon Grayson, Mr. Shut Up and Train, who's been, helping me out on that journey, and my wife as well, because she's in the healthcare space. And so keeping score around those things that are very important to you really matter. And it's a lesson learned from a lot of the conversations that we had during this interview series, because I listened to how folks kept themselves accountable, but also to how they measure success in their own individual lanes. And I hope that y'all go back and check out some of the interviews to learn more about that from the individuals that participated in the series. Next, we have you must have a principled conviction about what it is that's driving you. Part of this series that I learned the most from was, just this passion that folks had, this conviction that folks had that spoke to the drive that really, really pushed them forward on a daily basis and attached to what I just mentioned and how they keep score. This principle conviction that leads to the integrity of how you push forward, right? How you're treating people. This principle conviction in, how aren't promised, right? What the future holds, but when it comes to those things that are important to you, making sure that you are pushing forward and driving forward, and it's something that is in your heart and in your stomach, something that you talk from your stomach about, so that people can feel that passion when you share your dreams, when you share how you might be changing careers, when you share new ventures that you might be attaching yourself to, or just a new frame of mind, having that conviction to where you're telling some of the people that know you best. And they say, well, Greg, I've heard you say that before, or, I've heard you mention that before. That conviction is what tells people that, hey, it's time to not just only keep score, but I want you to help me in being part of my support system to keep me accountable as well. And so, last but certainly not least, and again, if y'all are just tuning in, I'm going over the 5 lessons learned from the interview series of Purpose Driven Pivot from our guests, and just things that I'm recalling is be willing to tell your journey. That's the last one. One of the biggest hurdles that that I see as it relates to folks that may think that they don't have the credentials. They may think that their story isn't intriguing. They may think that, oh, I just live on my little slice of, whatever, and do what I do. I'm not that interesting of a person. What I would tell you is that even if you think you're really interesting, or you might think you're not, and everything in between, you got to be willing to tell your story and your journey. You don't have to be on the big screen and the bright lights, but that willingness to be able to tell your trials and your tribulations. You never know how people around you will learn from those experiences that you're willing to share. And it takes courage to share things that you may have, goals that you may not have reached, or things that you may have wanted to obtain, but just haven't done it yet. Your willingness to be transparent and to tell that story, whether 2 people are learning about it, or 200 people, or 2,000, or 200,000, your willingness to tell that story and the power in that story is something that people can learn and pull from. Y'all would not believe the type of feedback that I received from some of the interviews and some of the people and some of the conversations that sparked from this interview series that really, really helped to change my perspective on the work that I was doing even through this series. And that was because every single person that participated last year in the launch event, every single person and team that participated in the conversations around purpose driven pivot going forward, those are folks that when you go back and check out the interviews, they were just willing to, based on an ask in my relationship with them, to not just be transparent about how they're pivoting, but they were willing to tell their story. Be willing to tell your story to the people that are not just around you. Now, I ain't saying you have to tell every stranger that you see walking down the street, but there is this opportunity, I believe, in this opportunity for people to learn from this dynamic around what your time, your talent, your treasure is, and telling that story and being willing to tell that story empowers so many other people to be able to tell theirs as well. And I believe that that's the type of energy that we've got to have, not just on our neighborhoods and communities, but we've got to have this type of energy in order to teach and increase teachable moments for our young folks, in order for us to bridge some of those intergenerational conversations that need to happen. I really, really firmly believe that this willingness to share, while it empowers us to, level up and reach our goals, this is how we start conversations. This is how we begin to work together. This is how we begin to unify around really, really important goals and narratives. And, when you tell your story, you not just continue to empower folks, but you also become better at telling it. Now, some people know a lot about just my story and how education transformed my life, and how, because of what I know about being civically engaged in politics and things and resources associated with how we build our communities, I learned how to continue to tell my story because I was willing to tell it to young folks in schools, to folks associated with, my professional career, and to my friends as well. I was willing to say, hey, this is where I need your assistance, or willing to just tell people and talk to people and write those things out and share them. And so those are the 5 lessons learned. Again, if you're just tuning in to this closeout session, I'm talking about the 5 lessons learned from this year-long interview series from Purpose Driven Pivot. And just to go over them before I go into the next part of the closeout session, they were, having a guiding compass. You must have that support system. Define those people, define that support system that's catching you and also lifting you up. Be willing to keep score on those things that you are incrementally gaining on and defining as new priorities, or even if you're doubling down on existing priorities. You must have a principled conviction around what it is that you're doing. Again, you not just a conviction and this hunger and this urge and this strength that you want to bring to the table, but it must be principled in the way that you talk about, integrity, and the way you treat people and lead people with dignity, and not, stripping away from folks, but you're giving life to the conversations. And last but certainly not least, be willing to tell your journey and be transparent in those things. Now, I'm not going to keep y'all for a whole hour. As y'all know, through this series, I've typically kind of gone through an hour-long dialogue. But, as we wrap up those 5 lessons learned, I wanted to go into 2 more specific areas around, how I wanted to wrap this particular session up as we think about what's to come related to this content. When I was talking to McKinley, we were talking through kind of the what we call a MAC, the first steps to make after you pivot. And what came to mind for me is that there's this discipline to taking those practical steps to move in a certain direction, as we know. But my message and what I learned from so many of the guests is that, don't take the shortcut, because either way it defines you to yourself. Don't take the shortcut around these things that will help you pivot, because either way, whether you do the work or you take the shortcut, it will define you to yourself. And so what do I mean by that? You got to be able to look in the mirror every day, based on this pivot and based on this journey, and not just in the spirit of keeping yourself accountable. You got to say, hey, am I doing what I need to do? Is there a disciplined regimen associated with me and my goals that I have for myself? And how am I keeping myself moving forward on those things? And so, as it relates to some of the first practical steps that I believe that folks can take from what I learned from, not just the interview series, but just, throughout the context of life, I firmly, firmly believe that, when you do something once, when you do something twice, when you do something 7 times, it begins to become a behavior, right? When you do something in the morning, when you have an official regimen, whether it be meditation, whether it be prayer in the afternoon, in the evenings, no matter what your discipline regimen might be, I think that's very, very strongly a part of those first practical steps that one needs to take when we think about purpose. And the power that's in those types of things is that, once something is developed as a behavior, once you built, the I'd say the regimen around what you're doing every day, every week, how you're keeping score, who you're talking to, the cadence in which you're talking to them, how you're leaning in and telling your story. I believe that you begin to develop the same way other organizations have a culture associated with what they do. I believe that you begin to have this internal culture associated with those things that you have defined as just important to you. You know, Are you focused on what you need to focus on during the day? Are you focused on what you need to focus on over the weekend, right? How are you defining balance in order to push you forward, whether it be Monday through Friday, or you're going on a retreat or something that speaks to professional development? What are those things that you're doing to increase this behavior around a lifelong learning exercise? What are you reading? Who are you listening to when it comes to what you're reading in new selections and content? I learned during this interview series that a big part of that success as it relates to saying, hey, I got this new idea, or I've got this new lease on life, I've got this new perspective that I'm going from. You don't want it to die down a week or 2 weeks later. What I learned from these interview series, or from these interviews and these great speakers that we had and panelists that we had, is that if you aren't disciplined about what it is that you're doing, if you don't have the behavioral integrity with yourself, right, and you're taking shortcuts for those things important to you, if they don't add up to you, they're not going to add up to anyone else. And if they may seem like they're adding up to other folks in the world, yeah, you might be able to get lucky a few times, but the consistency and the learning principles and the wisdom associated with those things, I believe, is in the discipline associated with those things. And so I'd love to hear y'all thoughts. Please tell me what it is, as it relates to, this interview series as we kind of continue to go through things. This closeout session is very, very important because it gives us another opportunity to not just summarize some of those things that we learn, but to continue to take in feedback. So I'd love to get you guys' perspective. Now, it might not be parallel to the lessons that I've learned, or even as it relates to those discipline things associated with pivots. Again, the interviews are at gregclay.com, so check them out. Continue to send me feedback, and as always, love to hear from folks. All right, and so let's get into the last thing. What are my specific calls to action as we close out Purpose Driven Pivot? I wish it was just one thing, right? But the conversations were just so dynamic. I mean, I learned stuff from the top end to the very end to the middle, things that I missed that when I went back and listened to some interviews, just like with a lot of content, I just learned so much. I just couldn't narrow them down to, just one thing as it relates specifically to a call of action. But what my calls of action kind of, well, two of them, one is very, very personal to what I do, but two of them speak directly to things that I just continue to hear, and the feeling around how people were talking about what it was that they were experiencing and trying to empower people to do along their journey. And the first call to action is, I want you to be able to give yourself some grace. Give yourself some grace in this moment as people seemingly say the world is getting back to normal to a degree out of the pandemic. Now, it's relative, sure, but I want you to give yourself some grace in how we've all had to adjust to so many things that have been going on internally and externally around us. These have not been normal circumstances, whether you believe what you're seeing or whether you've been on the receiving end of what you're seeing, whether you've been directly impacted by, certain things, or whether you haven't been impacted at all. We can certainly all agree that things have been different, especially as we move forward through 2021. And I want you, through one of my calls of actions, to give yourself some grace around how you've been able to navigate. Now, I'm not saying give yourself a pass on anything, but let's be realistic about the moments that have really, really allowed us to look at things very, very differently, whether it be a significant other, whether it be a significant opportunity, whether it be something that you took for granted, whether it be something that you lost, right, throughout this process, whether tangible or intangible, whether it was in a person or in a relationship. I think that we just got to be able to give ourselves some grace in order to give others grace as well as we move forward through this particular season, because there's so much work that we've got to continue to do. If we aren't giving ourselves grace in things that we have to do, then it becomes extremely, extremely challenging for us to get to where we need to be. And so that's my first call to action. My second call to action is very, very personal, and it really is, and it speaks to the action of so many things that folks were doing as we interviewed. Get off the sidelines. Get off the sideline and get active. The time that you have is not promised. The talent that you have, while it's very, very unique to you, people may or may not know it. And the treasure that you have, if you have it and you're able to give it and you're able to invest in, you're able to do what you need to do with it, your time, talent, and treasure, y'all, we've got to be able to get off the sidelines in this season going forward. There's so many people that I know that just are disengaged from not just, what I believe the process is, but folks that might not be as engaged, right? Even after giving yourself some grace, just not as engaged. And even before the pandemic, that just weren't as engaged in what it was that was going on out in the community, out in the world, out in their career, out in their industry. And so my message today is that we have got to get off the sidelines. For those conversations that you're at the corporate table in, for those conversations you're at, on the Microsoft Teams or the Zoom, whatever it might be, make your opinion known, make your perspective known. If there's something that you want to do as it relates to helping seniors or young folks, if there's something that you're looking forward to, you always had a passion to, y'all, we got to get off the sidelines. And a lot of the interviews that I had spoke to just so much action around getting busy in their space, right? Or being productive in their space. But what I also heard so many of the times was while I was productive in this space, I began to learn, I began to evolve. And y'all, that doesn't happen when you're just standing on the sidelines. We've got to suit up and get in the game. And so get off of the sidelines, which yields itself to my third and of course, very, very personal point is, part of my pivot has been really, really speaking to, again, the civic engagement space that I believe is my life's work. This opportunity for folks to be enlightened, not just by what we see in civics related to politics, but be enlightened by this broader conversation related to our relationship to our communities. Because by mere definition of civic, it's the relationship that we have with our community around us. Y'all, my third call to action is that we have got to plug in politically and civically because I believe that it's such a strong answer to some of the things that we've been experiencing in our communities. And while we've talked about that in some ways during some conversations, it wasn't a regular recurring theme. It's just my personal call to action as it relates to what it is that I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing, what my personal journey has been. I just believe that we've got to get more politically and civically engaged. And so that's my call to action. As you think about political things coming forward, when you think about where you could yield and use your time, your talent, and your treasure going forward, y'all, not just getting off the sidelines, but being someone that's in the space and recruiting more people to be in the space. When you say, hey, look, I'm willing to, get active and not yield the leverage that I could see in my communities, I just think that our communities are a better place for it. And not just in the city of Atlanta or the state of Georgia, whether you're in Texas, whether you're in DC, whether you're in California, because I know that, we've got some folks that are just watching us from a lot of different places. I believe that the way we get active in our communities and our neighborhoods will really, really transform things going forward. And so that's all I got, y'all. I have been very, very honored and privileged, very, very honored and privileged to have this platform, something that we created, because of the vision associated with not just one moment in time, but just this opportunity to make so many different memories. But the biggest thing that I learned from this process is that when you take those steps forward and be willing to tell not just your story, but you offer this opportunity for others to tell their story as well. So many other people are empowered by, listening to and seeing and hearing those things that get them closer to their purpose. And it might call for a pivot in another direction. Folks might take a 180 turn on what it is that they might be doing. Some people might take a 40-degree turn. They just might pivot slightly in another direction. But what I do know for sure, especially from the conversation and the context of things that I've been able to learn throughout this process, is that when you're willing to tell your story, when you're willing to talk about a narrative, when you're willing to say, hey, these are the things that are valuable to me and they might be valuable to you. When you're willing to say, hey, these are the most traumatic things that have occurred in my life, and you might be able to learn from these things as you continue to navigate through life as well. Y'all, there's so much power in those types of things and opportunities that it's been my honor and my privilege to obey my God and providing this platform to you through Purpose Driven Pivot. And so, again, you can find all of the interviews at gregclay.com. Stay tuned for things that are coming up because we've got some awesome opportunities on the horizon that I had to say no to during this series because folks were just enjoying the content so much. But just stay tuned for what it is that we'll be doing next. Again, I've been your host, Greg Clay. We've had just awesome experiences through this platform. And I'm looking forward to the conversations that we'll continue for. And so y'all be good, be blessed, and remember, the things that you expect from other people, also expect from yourself in order to pivot towards those things that you're most passionate about. And so we will see y'all soon. We'll talk to y'all soon. And let me know your thoughts on all the things that were shared, not just during this closeout session, but also during the things that were shared for the entire interview series that you can find at my website, gregclay.com. All right. We'll see y'all soon. Be good. Later.